All right, welcome back, everybody, to the brain injury discussion. This is your host, Jay. Today, we're going to talk about brain injury as well as animal companions. What role does animal companions or pets play in life? Not just for the brain injured, but what else do they play a role in when it comes to the brain? Like always, sources will be in the description below. I always encourage people to read those sources. And also, we'd appreciate feedback in the form of a like, maybe a comment down below, and maybe subscribe to the channel. We put out this information weekly. We try to keep it informative, educational, but we also try to keep it applicable as well. But with that being said, we have a lot to get into, so let's get started. First, we should talk about development in the brain development. Think about children and how they interact with pets. And what we see, according to this article down here, is that pets typically have a very positive influence on developing brains. So, that child who is around pets is going to have more information, more stimulus to observe because of the animals that are in their house. And so what we do see is that, yes, there is a positive influence on developing brains. We also see that an animal companion typically contributes to overall emotional health and positive behavior patterns in children. And so having a pet, again, barring allergies, barring other things, it's good for their brain. It's good for their brain development. It's also good for their emotions as well. An interesting statistic I saw in this article was about 68% of American households and 46% of British households, they have pets. And these pets can provide emotional comfort. Again, we're dealing with developing brains. They're intaking a lot of information. And what we see is that when you have an animal companion, like a cat, like a dog, in the household, especially for the child, that child will probably have the following activated in times of distress around an animal companion. Let's look at this list: oxytocin, cortisol, dopamines, other endorphins, prolactin, and serotonin. All of those things help us feel happy. And so when we see in the development of someone's brain is that we'll see that generally speaking, there is a positive effect to having an animal or a pet in the house. And so activating all these things helps keep someone happy, emotionally happy, and also helps, influence that developing brain by giving it more stimuli. And so those are things to consider when, child is asking, can we get a kitten? Can we get a puppy? Again, it might not be a bad idea, barring like allergies, sensitivities, and so on. But generally speaking, a pet is good for brain development, especially for children. But let's move on. Let's talk about adults and companions and their brains. Again, we see that this activates emotional areas in the amygdala and the frontal cortex. This area being the frontal cortex, and this area being the amygdala. And what we find is that if it's activating those areas, it's activating a lot of the emotional sensor points of the brain. Think about our video on the limbic system. The limbic system is the kind of transfer spot and the origin of a lot of the chemicals that allow for emotions to be present. And so those are things that we need to consider. Okay, having an animal companion is good for our emotional state. We also see that having a pet in the house reduces rates of depression, anxiety, and also reduces someone's stress level. Again, can you really be mad when you have a cat purring on your lap or a dog, just happy to see you, wants to play? Again, those are things that reduces stress for people. And generally, that's a good thing. We also see that there's autonomic nervous system involvement. You might be asking, Jay, what are the autonomic nervous systems? Check that out in our video. But we're talking parasympathetic. So we're talking the rest and digest system, as well as sympathetic nervous systems. So we're talking sympathetic being the fight or flight response. And so what we definitely see is that a lot of these areas of the brain are affected positively by animal companions being in the home. And what we also see physiologically speaking is that, we see that it affects the cardiac rate or heart rate or pulse. It also affects the blood pressure and the respiratory rate. Typically, heart rate goes down, the blood pressure goes down, and the respiratory rate goes down or up, depending on the situation. But usually that leads to better overall health. And so we see that not just with children for the developing brain, we also see this is good for the developed brain. And so when we take this into consideration, we see that overall having a pet is a great thing for the brain. It's really beneficial. But there's more. We should talk about pets and their role in therapy. And what we have found, according to this article here, is that I picked these four, but there's more in that article that we can go for. But I picked these four because they definitely involve the brain. And what we see with stroke is that there's a 27% reduced mortality for pet owners. And you might be thinking, well, Jay, why does that matter? Well, that means 27% of pet owners survive more than non-pet owners. And so when we take that into consideration, having an animal companion in the house makes you more likely to survive a stroke. It also increases the motivation and reduces aphasia. Hey, I like to talk to my cat, and I'm pretty sure people like to talk to their puppies as well. And so we see that that's generally a better thing, right? We also see that with Parkinson's, there's a decreased need for medications. It also improves someone's fatigue. And also, probably a lesser known side effect of Parkinson's is their appetite. Again, you have to nourish the body, nourish the brain. And so, a lot of these disease processes decreases the appetite to a very bad point. And so having a pet, when you're feeding them, one could infer that, okay, I'm feeding my cat, I'm feeding my dog. Maybe I should eat as well. Maybe I need some nourishment. With multiple sclerosis or MS, it helps retain white and gray matter in the brain. Again, white and gray matter are very big parts of the brain. And then we'll also see dementia, again, not necessarily a brain injury, but could be in part caused by a brain injury. We'll see that those with dementia, when they have a pet, we see reduced agitation. Again, kind of a session of, oh my gosh, what's going on? And then we see reduced anxiety and reduced depression. When we're able to reduce those things, we are able to control those things a little bit better. And so, generally speaking, pets are great for all of these and then some. And so, a lot of beneficial health effects for having a dog, having a cat, having a goldfish, having a pet or an animal companion in the home, right? A lot of these, they don't seem very big, but when you take it in the big picture of things, actually this kind of makes a point that having an animal companion in the home is usually beneficial to those with brain injuries or degenerative brain conditions. But let's move on. Let's talk about alert dogs, right? Dogs can be trained very well. And so dogs can be alerted to seizures. They can be alerted to identify the seizures. And they are very responsive to emotions and certain cues, certain changes that maybe humans can't pick up on. And so, again, with that kind of training, think about soldiers, police, paramedics, whoever, firefighters, they need training, but they can be trained to react a certain way. And they also have the tools to do so because of a keen sense of smell. And so let's move over to this graphic here to the right side of the page, and we'll see that some dogs can anticipate a seizure. They'll be able to detect some of those subtle changes. And, they might see that, okay, I know this pattern happens with my human. And so I'm going to start alerting them because I'm trained to alert them. And again, they can be trained to respond in a good way, in a very beneficial way. Hey, this dog is alerting the owner, hey, you're about to have a seizure. You need to go somewhere safe. Or they might be able to respond to a seizure. Again, coached to stay calm. When the dog is calm, other people are going to be calm too, and they can be trained to carry out certain duties. Again, the training needs to be there, but in this case, the dog is preventing further head injury to the owner. And by protecting that head from, seizing and hitting the ground multiple times or hitting the floor, which could cause brain injury, which could cause damage. Again, this dog is doing a life-saving thing right there, and that dog is doing a good job. And dogs can be trained to do this. And so that's why it's a good conversation that, okay, if you have frequent seizures, maybe this is something that maybe you should be aware of, if not look into. And as a brain injury case manager, I need to be aware that yes, a dog would require training, but this might be good for someone who has frequent seizures. But with that being said, let's continue on. Let's talk about dogs and low blood sugar. One of the most popular videos on this channel is about hypoglycemia. Now, why am I bringing this up with puppies and hypoglycemia or low blood sugar? Well, because they can alert. Some dogs can be trained to identify hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. Again, their keen sense of smell, like we talked about with seizures, they can help identify the subtle changes that maybe we don't see in the kind of body liquids like saliva, sweat, and there's someone's breath, right? If you've ever been around someone who is in a diabetic low, their breath might smell fruity, it might smell sweet. Their lips might turn purple. Again, dogs can pick up on those smells a lot quicker than we can. They have a much better sense of smell. But again, that requires training because then once they start detecting the owner, then they can be trained to react a certain way. Maybe they're going to start barking. Maybe they're going to start reacting and saying, "No, I'm not moving. You need to check your blood sugar." And so, again, that keen sense of smell identifies the changes that we can't because we don't have that keen sense of smell to detect the changes in the saliva, in the sweat, and in someone's breath until maybe later, until it's way more prominent. And so these are things to consider if you are a type 1 diabetic and you go into frequent lows, maybe this might be something to look into. That way, your animal companion, this furry friend, um, can say, listen, you're going into diabetic low because I've been trained to react this way when you smell that way. Again, this isn't smells that we're smelling as humans. This is smells that the dog is noticing. And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, this is just another example of many. So let's talk about service animals. Again, less than 1% of people in the United States with disabilities have a service animal, and a lot of conditions could benefit from a service animal. And statistically speaking, those who have a service animal, 80% are positively affected by having a service animal. And I want to go through this quick little list of service animals that could really be beneficial to these individuals. Again, being a veteran, this one is one I've seen in a few friends, the PTSD. Again, this is true with veterans. If you're always on edge, if you come from an environment that is high stress, high emotions, high physicality, the adjustment period is not necessarily good. But having a service animal that is trained to remain calm and to be kind of um, that calmness in the world of chaos around a lot of noise and so on, what we see is that service dogs can be really beneficial to those who suffer from PTSD. We'll also see service animals good for emotional support like depression and anxiety. And again, to there's a myriad of different ways that you could go about that, but having a service dog might be a good way to curb that anxiety. Something, that dog that is trained to be calm in all situations. Same thing goes with veterans and PTSD. Um, Now, another more common form of service animal is physical blindness. Think about those seeing eye dogs. Those dogs are, typically have a handle for their owner, but the dog will help guide them into places that, make sure that they're not walking into walls, make sure that they're not tripping and falling over some hazards, right? All of that is good information for someone who would require a service animal. And then you also have seizures and hypoglycemia, like we talked about in the last two slides. Again, these are service animals. They're not necessarily pets, but they are trained and specifically trained to address either some deficit, some disability, or some illness. And so these are things we need to keep in mind when we see service animal, don't touch it. Let let the service animal do their job. When they're out and about, they're on the job. So service animals do play a vital role in the brain injury community, and we do see brain injury quite common with PTSD, depression, anxiety, physical blindness, as well as seizures and hypoglycemia. But what does this leave me as a brain injury case manager to conclude? Well, generally speaking, animals, they're good for developing brains. So if you have a child in the house, maybe have that conversation about, or do you want a puppy, a kitten, or so on? Maybe have that conversation with the family. Again, having an animal is a lot better to absorb that information than on a computer screen, if we're being real. So animals are good for the developing brain. We also see that animals, they stimulate positive emotions and endorphins. They keep you happy. They reduce stress. They reduce your anxiety and depression. Again, if you suffer from one of those or if you have those conditions, might be worthwhile looking into it. You never know, it might be very beneficial. Also, we see useful and positive effects for therapy. Okay, if you are going through stroke, going through a stroke, or you have a form of dementia, or maybe you have MS or Parkinson's, maybe having a animal companion in the home would be a good idea. Maybe that could be very helpful to you. Maybe that give you maybe that little bit of an extra edge to help you along the way. Also, we see that it is especially helpful for trained dogs to react to seizures and hypo or low blood sugar or hypoglycemia. We can also see a lot of these dogs and some animals be certified as legitimate service animals. And so, as a brain injury case manager, I need to be aware of these things. I need to think what is good for the brain that is developing, and the brain that's undergoing therapy, or what kind of service animals could someone benefit from? And that's something that I need to be at least aware of as a brain injury case manager, because we shouldn't just discount uh, dogs, cats, service animals, other kinds of animal companions just because they're not like a doctor prescribed medication. And so it's good for me to be aware as a brain injury case manager of the benefits of having an animal around. But with that being said, I think I'll leave it there. And here are my references. They're very interesting sources. I encourage you to read them. Like always, I encourage you also to like, maybe comment down below if you've seen a service animal, or maybe tell me if you have one or know of someone that has one. And maybe share this video with a friend. Maybe share to someone who could benefit from having an animal in their life. And so keep that in mind. We'd also appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. We put this information out weekly. We try to keep it informative, educational, but we also try to keep it applicable as well. But like always, I hope everyone has a good day, and don't forget to protect your brains.